Mr. President, as our colleagues know, just yesterday we received the Congressional Budget Office's analysis of the most recent version of the Republican health care bill, the bill that passed out of the House of Representatives, also known as Trumpcare 2.0. I encourage all of us, every one of our colleagues, to read the CBO report and to read it carefully. For those who are interested, it can be found online at www.cbo.gov, and on the front page, you can link to the report, which I have here in my hand. And I think it is worth reminding our colleagues that the Congressional Budget Office is comprised of professionals, budget experts, that the current director of the Congressional Budget Office was selected by the Republican chairman of the House Budget Committee and the Republican chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. And without an umpire on budget issues, this Senate would be in absolute chaos when it came to determining the impact of many of our major decisions. And so it's very dangerous when people start attacking the umpire when it comes to these important issues that can have literally life or death implications for our constituents. And what you will find in this most recent Congressional Budget Office report is that the most recent House Republican plan is even worse than the original plan, which also was the subject of a Congressional Budget Office report. And what this CBO report tells us is that, like the earlier version, this so-called health bill is really a massive transfer of wealth from working class and middle-income Americans to the top 1% wealthiest in our country, and some very powerful special interest. Its title would much more fittingly be Wealth Care, not Health Care. So let's just take a look at some of the findings that are in this report that can be found online. And I want to turn to page 4 of the report, where the Congressional Budget Office reaches the conclusion that if we adopt this House proposal, if the Senate votes for the House Republican bill, there will be 23 fewer of our fellow Americans who have access to affordable health care when it's phased in than today. So that if we were to adopt this, if this becomes law, we are saying to 23 million of our fellow Americans, sorry, we're going to take away your access to affordable health care. It's right there on page 4. And that's because what this so-called health care bill does is take away some of the supports that provide access to affordable health care. It reduces for millions of Americans the tax credits that they use for their premiums in the Affordable Care Act exchanges. And as you'll find on page 3 of this report, it also cuts Medicaid by $834 billion. Now, some people will say, hey, no problem, that's just going to be sent to the states, and states are going to have more flexibility. The Congressional Budget Office has been very clear that when you're talking about Medicaid cuts of this impact, one of two things happen. Either a lot fewer people get access to affordable health care, or the states have to raise taxes on the people of their states to ensure continued access. But this notion that somehow that there's all this extra funds floating around, that greater flexibility will just allow the same amount of dollars, so fewer dollars to go further with no negative impact, is a fairy tale. In fact, Medicaid already has lots of provisions for flexibility. They have a whole suite of waiver provisions. Our state of Maryland exercised lots of waivers under the Medicaid program to allow it to be creative and flexible. And this $834 billion cut, we found out yesterday with the president's budget, is just the first round of cuts, that they're proposing another almost $610 billion cut in Medicaid. Total cut, $1.4 trillion to Medicaid. And I would remind my colleagues that in addition to helping working class Americans get access to health care, 2/3 of Medicaid money goes to help seniors in nursing homes. 60% of seniors in nursing homes use Medicaid to help pay the bills, and 2/3 of it goes to those seniors and people with disabilities. So the Congressional Budget Office is telling us that this Trumpcare 2.0, this latest version of the Republican health care bill, is going to result in 23 million fewer of our fellow Americans having access to health care. It's going to cut Medicaid, and this is just the first round, by $834 billion. So why do this, right? Who is benefiting from this? Well, let's look at the very first page of the Congressional Budget Office report. It reduces revenues by $992 billion, right? So it cuts Medicaid by $834 billion, and it reduces revenues coming in by $992 billion. So essentially transferring revenues that are going to help tens of millions of our fellow Americans get access to health care and transferring that to tax breaks. And those tax breaks go overwhelmingly to the very wealthiest Americans, to the top 1%. In fact, one of the things we did when we put together the Affordable Care Act to help pay for it was we said, you know what, we think that wealthier households should have to pay a small fee on their unearned income to be devoted to the Medicare Trust Fund. You know, everyone in the country knows when they get that pay stub, it tells them how much is taken out for Medicare, 3.4%. And we said, look, that should not just apply to earned income from hardworking people, but if you're in the top 1%, if you're a higher income earner, you should also be contributing, some of your capital gains revenue to help strengthen Medicare. And that's what we did. And yet this bill provides all those households with a tax cut. In fact, for millionaires, the average annual tax cut as a result of this bill will be $50,000. $50,000 tax cut to millionaires while cutting access to affordable care for 23 million of our fellow Americans. Why all these tax cuts are in something masquerading as a health care bill, I don't know, but we now know certainly who benefits the most from this legislation. And beyond those top 1% income earners, you've also got insurance companies and the pharmaceutical industry. They get some tax breaks as well under this legislation. And finally, Mr. President, I said at the outset that this Trumpcare 2.0, or the most recent Republican health care bill, is worse than the original one, because the original one was rotten to the core. I mean, the original one had most of the provisions I'm talking about. So what got added that makes this one even worse? And to find that, Mr. President, people should look at page 5 of this report and see what happens to people in states that decide to get rid of the patient protection provisions in the Affordable Care Act. Because we've heard a lot of talk about how that House bill isn't going to really hurt people with pre-existing conditions like diabetes and asthma. We've heard all that. But here's what the Congressional Budget Office report says. This is what the referee, the umpire, has to say about that with respect to those states. It says community-rated premiums would rise over time and people who are less healthy, and then they state, including those with pre-existing conditions or newly acquired medical conditions, right? So people who've had any kind of pre-existing condition or prior health condition that an insurance company will argue makes them a much greater risk, that people who are less healthy and those with pre-existing conditions would ultimately be unable to purchase comprehensive, non-group health insurance at premiums comparable to those under current law if they could purchase it at all. They go on to say, despite the additional funding that would be available under H.R. 1628, that's that House bill, despite that additional funding to help reduce premiums. Then they go on, and I hope our colleagues will pay attention to this conclusion. As a result, the non-group markets in those states would become unstable for people with higher than average expected health care costs. Translation, people with pre-existing conditions, people who, because they have diabetes or asthma, or as a child, they have a congenital disease, any pre-existing condition will make it much harder for them to afford any kind of coverage at all, and ultimately that the non-group markets in those states will become unstable for those people. So, Mr. President, that's why this Trumpcare 2.0, this House health care bill, this Republican bill, took a really rotten bill and actually made it worse. And it's not enough, colleagues, for people to make a few cosmetic changes to this, to put a couple Band-Aids on it here in the Senate and say, hey, you know what? We made this thing better. Because this is rotten to its core. If people really want to address health care reform, let's work together to improve the exchanges. And there are common sense things that we can do to improve the exchanges, but you don't improve the exchanges by cutting Medicaid by $834 billion. That has nothing to do with exchanges. And you don't improve the exchanges by giving a windfall tax credit to the wealthiest Americans. That has nothing to do with health care. So, Mr. President, Trumpcare 2.0, this Republican health care bill is rotten to the core. Let's throw it out and let's focus on the question of fixing the exchanges. If people want to do that, we can actually get something done. But let's not pretend that we're doing health care when really what the goal so far has been is wealth care.